As the breeze sweeps the last autumn leaves off into the world of winter, I will tell you of the time long ago, before Redwall Abbey was built in Mossflower. In those days, there was no freedom for woodlanders. We were cruelly oppressed under the harsh rule of Verdaga Green Eyes and his daughter Zarmina. It was a mouse who saved Mossflower. His name is known to all, Martin the Warrior. As I sit here in the warmth and peace, it all lives again in my memory. A strange tale of love and war, friend and foe, great happiness, and mighty deeds. Gaze into the fire, young one. Listen to me, and I will tell you the story.
Hail fellow travelers, Tim from Secret Fire Books here, and this time around I'm going to be reviewing MOSSFLOWER by Brian Jacques. This is the second book in the Redwall series in publication order, and the third book in chronological order. Now, when this book was originally published in 1988, it was meant to be a prequel to the original Redwall, and forms a sort of trilogy with Redwall and its direct sequel, Matameo. However, subsequent entries in the series would also turn this book into the middle book of another trilogy featuring the character Martin the Warrior. The first book being Martin the Warrior, and the third book being The Legend of Luke. And if you're confused about the timeline at this point, you might as well jump ship now, because things do not get less complicated from here on out. It's why these books are best read as standalone novels, in my opinion. Before the time of peaceful Redwall Abbey, Mossflower Forest was a dark, dangerous place ruled by the evil wildcat King Green Eyes. Eventually, though, King Green Eyes would be murdered by his daughter Princess Zarmina, who would pin the blame on her brother Gingivier and take over the army of Castle Cotir for herself. With no other choice, the Woodlanders then fled to the underground sanctuary of Brockhall, home of Lady Bella the Badger, who knit them into a sort of resistance movement. Things would eventually look up for the resistance movement after they successfully rescued a mysterious young mouse named Martin from the dungeons of Castle Cotir. Seeing as Martin was clearly much braver, bolder, stronger, and apparently more combat capable than all of her friends, Bella convinced him to set out on a quest to find her long-lost father, Boar the Fighter, the only warrior who could lead them to victory against Zarmina's army. And so, with his new friends Dinny the Mole and Gonth the Mouse Thief, Martin sets off on the journey to find the mythical mountain fortress of Salamandastron, where he hopes to find Boar the Fighter and bring him back to supply the reinforcements that Mossflower desperately needs. Little does Martin know that this very quest will turn him into a legend himself. Now, when I reread the original Redwall a few weeks ago, I was really pleasantly surprised at how well it held up to my childhood memories. I was very happy with that book. And I had kind of some high expectations going in to Mossflower, because I also remember this one being a lot of fun. But I was actually very disappointed about this.
Oh, no, no, no.
And there are some things that I did like about this book, some things that I really enjoyed, but there were a lot of times where I was getting really frustrated and just downright angry with this book. So before I get in there and just dismember this thing, I do want to talk about the positives. First of all, there's some really cool world building going on in this book. And something I learned recently is that unlike the first Redwall, which was only ever meant to be a story that Brian Jacques read to his students at the Royal School for the Blind, it was never meant to be published. MOSSFLOWER is the first book in the series which was meant to be a commercial product. It was the first book that was made with a publishing deal in mind, and so Brian Jacques clearly knew that he had to sand off some of those rough edges in his world building. There are still plenty of rough edges, but we'll get to those. The world of MOSSFLOWER definitely feels a little more filled out and robust in this book, and Brian Jacques introduces quite a few elements that would end up being recurring elements in the rest of the series. For one thing, we have the Skipper of Otters. In the world of Redwall, all the tribes of the otters are united under a skipper, who is one otter who kind of leads them all, and he's always called Skipper. No matter what his name is, he's always referred to as Skipper through every generation of otter. There's also Loamhedge, the ancestral home of the mice who would eventually form the monastic order of Redwall Abbey. There's also the idea that sea rats are actual seafaring pirates. They have their own pirate ships and they sail around on the open ocean, raiding the coastlines and going to war with each other. And there's also the most important element he introduces, the mountain fortress of Salamandastron, home of the legendary Badger Lords, guarded by the fighting hares of the Long Patrol, who all act and talk exactly like Basil from Book 1, for some reason. And speaking of fighting, there is a lot of action in this book. Despite the first Redwall being focused around an actual siege, there are a lot more pitched battles and firefights with bows and arrows and hand-to-hand, well, paw-to-paw combat in this book. And it gets really kind of violent. This is the kind of dark, gritty stuff that I remember from this relatively cozy children's series. I mean, some of these battles just get downright brutal. The Silver Badger made a rat into 2 half-rats with his sword. Martin extinguished a spitting face with his blade. The Badger used his sword hilt to pulp a rat who came too near. This is a children's book. But the thing that I really like the most of all in this book is actually the 3 main characters on the front here. We have Martin the Warrior, our main protagonist, and his 2 accomplices on this quest he's on. Dinny the Mole and Gaunt the Mouse Thief, whom I recently learned is apparently a self-insert of Brian Jacques. But I really like these characters. They have some really good camaraderie. I like the way they bicker with each other and kind of bounce off one another. And the quest that they undertake to find the legendary mountain of Salamandastron and this legendary Badger warrior, Boar the Fighter, that part was my favorite part of the whole book. Seeing them just trek across landscapes they've never been to, meet animals they've never seen before, and have these little episodic adventures throughout the greater narrative. I was loving every single bit of that. It kind of reminded me of the best parts of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and the other questing fantasies that I was used to reading as a kid. And unfortunately, it stands in sharp contrast to the B-plot of this book. But again, we'll get there. Now, before I get into my major criticisms of this book, I do want to talk about my nitpicks. They're the little teeny tiny things that didn't necessarily get in the way of me enjoying this book, but I feel like I need to bring them up because some of them just really confuse me, and they've been confusing me ever since I was a kid. Now, I think most of them fall under the general umbrella of Brian Jacques just getting things wrong. There are quite a few facts from the real world that Brian Jacques gets wrong in the Redwall books for some reason. First of all, throughout the entire series, Brian Jacques refers to frogs and toads as reptiles. Now, without trying to sound too insulting to Mr. Jacques, God rest his soul, I think most children know that frogs and toads are not reptiles. They may not know what an amphibian is, but I feel like most of them know that frogs and reptiles are completely different things. He also tends to get the names of historical weapons confused. For instance, there are a lot of rapiers used in the Redwall series. Historically, a rapier is a long, one-handed sword with a very thin blade used for thrusting attacks, stabbing attacks. And in the Renaissance era, this became a favorite sidearm used by military officers and the noble class. And because it became so popular of a weapon, entire schools of swordplay rose up around the rapier and would eventually form what we know as the modern sport of fencing, using a sort of modernization of those weapons, referred to as épée or foils. Now, I actually took fencing classes in middle school, and I still have my own fencing foil right here. So as you can see, it has what's called a pistol grip guard. It's sort of made to be ergonomic so that you grip it like this and you're already in position for the thrusts and parries that you use in fencing. Now, obviously, it's not any kind of real weapon. There's no ground edges on this, no sharp edges. The tip is actually a button. There's a wire that feeds electronics through this blade into this little module right here, and that connects to the scoring system so that the judges know whether you've scored a hit or a miss. So even though it's not an exact historically accurate replica of a rapier, it's close enough. It's the closest modern approximation we have of one of those kind of swords. And so whenever you're reading a book and you see the word rapier pop up, this is more or less the kind of thing that the writer is talking about. Brian Jacques seems to think that a rapier is another word for a short sword. Don't know how that happened. But the biggest and most confusing of all is something that happens in this book. Now, later in the book, we are introduced to a character named Tim Ballisto, or TB. He's one of Martin the Warrior's old friends. And TB's real name is Tim. The Ballisto part comes from the word ballista. And this is because he is a warrior mouse who specializes in the construction of ballistas. Except he doesn't actually build ballistas. He builds catapults. Look, I know that there are two really big siege weapons used historically in warfare, but a ballista is a giant crossbow that shoots giant crossbow bolts. A catapult is a pulley and lever system that launches big, heavy rocks and other heavy objects. They're completely different things. I don't know how he got those mixed up. Okay, this is it. Time to dig my fangs into this book, metaphorically speaking. Now, first of all, the first big problem that I have with this book is that there are way too many characters. I kept track of every single named character in this book, and then afterwards, I looked it up on the Redwall wiki, which, by the way, big shout out to the people who run the Redwall wiki. They are an invaluable resource for me, and it's pretty cool. Whoever runs their YouTube channel actually commented on one of my videos recently. That was nice of them. But Redwall wiki was able to confirm for me that there are 100 named characters in this book. 100.
That's a lot of nuts!
This is a 370-page book, and 300 pages in, Brian Jacques is still introducing characters with names, with dialogue, with backgrounds. And the thing is, most of them don't even stick around and do that much. Something that I noticed about this book, I didn't notice it so much in Redwall, but when I noticed it in this book, I realized, oh, that's right, he does that in a lot of these. He will invent new characters simply to solve a single problem. It's like he comes across some kind of situation in his story, some kind of issue that needs to be resolved, and he'll just say, okay, I'll come up with a new character. I'll introduce a new character with a unique name and background and personality and everything, and their sole purpose in the narrative will be to resolve this issue. And then we'll never see them again. They'll either never do anything for the rest of the story, or they'll get killed off a few sentences after they resolve whatever issue they were meant to resolve. There is literally a moment in this story where he introduces a new villain. And I'd forgotten that this villain exists. I was reading the book and was like, oh, wow, this guy's gnarly. Where did he come from? What's going to happen with this guy? And in the very next chapter, he introduces another character whose sole purpose is to kill that first character. And he does so in the very next chapter. Mr. Jacques, Brian, can I call you Brian? I know you're dead, but I still want to be polite. Why are you doing this to me? There's another moment later in the story where it seems like things are kind of gearing up for the final confrontation. Like the Woodlanders and the army of Cotir have been going at each other for a while, and so they've lost a lot of animals on either side. They've lost a lot of soldiers on either side, and it seems like we're losing all these named characters. So clearly things are getting really bad. Clearly we're done introducing characters because we're killing off a lot of them. And then who should step in from out of the forest but a mercenary army of 500 foxes.
500 warrior rats.
Oh my gosh, Brian Lee Durfee, if you're watching this video, I'm so sorry I made fun of you in that first Redwall review, because there are just things about this book that don't make sense. But none of that can even compare to the biggest problem of them all. And unfortunately, it's the same kind of problem that I had with Redwall, except it's 10 times worse. The main villain of MOSSFLOWER is so stupid. Lady Zarmina Green Eyes, the queen of MOSSFLOWER Forest, might be the dumbest villain I've read in a long time. And here's the thing. People throw around that whole, oh, this villain is too stupid to win kind of thing all the time. People say it about Sauron from Lord of the Rings. Oh, he never expected a little hobbit to wander into Mordor and destroy his ring. Oh, he really should have seen that coming. Or Voldemort from Harry Potter. He's really dumb. He got defeated by a bunch of teenagers every year for 7 years until it finally killed him. He's a big dummy. None of them are nearly as stupid as Sarmina Green Eyes. There's a moment in this series where Queen Zarmina decides that she's had enough with all the Woodlanders, with all the cute little cuddly woodland critters who she's trying to subjugate. And to be fair, it's implied that she is out of her mind. It's implied that she is mentally disturbed. But still, what she decides to do is boggling to the mind. She decides that she's had enough. She's had enough with struggling with these Woodlanders. She's just going to kill them all. She and her soldiers are going to go out into the forest and just kill any animal they find. Okay, whatever. Not a great strategy if you want to have a kingdom to rule over, but okay, that's what she wants to do? Fine. So she leaves the castle with her entire army. Her entire army. All the soldiers, all of the guards. She doesn't leave a single one behind to protect her castle. Not a single one. And so what happens? All the good guys sneak into her castle and find a way to tear it down.
Failure is your destiny. You disrespect yourself and your nation. You are made of stupid.
So yeah, needless to say, the B-plot of MOSSFLOWER involving the Resistance and fighting against Zarmina and waiting for Martin and Bor the Fighter to return is a far cry from the actual quest that takes on in the A-plot. And yeah, there were so many times where I was reading the stuff about Martin and Gonth and Dinny on their glorious little adventure and being like, oh man, this is a lot of fun. I'm so happy I'm reading this part. And then I'd flip to the next chapter and it would be back with the Woodlanders and MOSSFLOWER and Zarmina and her army. And I'd just be like, oh no, not this again. So yeah, when this book is good, it's pretty good. It's really enjoyable. But when it's bad, it is so brutally, stupidly bad. I know, I'm getting all worked up over a kid's book, but like I said, I had some big expectations for this book, and they just did not meet them. Unlike Redwall, this book did not stand the test of time for me. So I will say that it has not diminished my enthusiasm for the rest of the series. I still intend on reading the rest of the Redwall books. I just started the third one the other night, and I'm having a lot of fun with it so far. It's been pretty good so far. And yeah, I'm definitely going to read the rest of the series. I will say, however, if you've never read any of the Redwall books before, I would not recommend starting with MOSSFLOWER. If anything, you should probably read this after you've read some of the other books in the series, because there are some cool story elements and world-building elements that go a long way, but for the most part, the plot is very lopsided. But that's all just my opinion. Let me know in the comments, guys. Have you ever read MOSSFLOWER? What did you think of it? And regardless, I hope you'll join me next time when I review Matameo. Until then, as always, farewell and keep reading.